So I imagine when most people saw the copy for the event, and the title of the event being The Poetry of Consciousness, that they took that to be a metaphor. Fundamentally, I think the way that poetry is perceived in the modern world, and certainly in a lot of people's minds who don't have a specific interest in the medium, is it is probably used as a metaphor more than an actual art form. We hear it spoken a lot, the poetry of birds, or the countryside, or a river, or football, something like that. And that's valid, but I think in some way that's indicative of the fact that people really have lost the thread of what poetry can do as a potentiality, especially as it relates to something like consciousness. And I want to speak very literally about the title of the event. Literal thinking is obviously normally a sign of stupidity. You can make your own decision on whether that's the case here or not. For me, a huge element, because I'm pretty much a full-time poet, as much as that's a bizarre thing to say. I write and I read kind of professionally because I teach, and also my practice is kind of a daily practice as an artist working within language. Pretty much makes me a poet. And the huge thing that's motivated me doing something like that is the question of why. Obviously the question of why I would become a poet in the first place, but more than that, why poetry does what it does. For example, there's so many elements of poetry practice and text practice that, especially in our culture, even in our aesthetic culture, is moved to the margins as something like art for art's sake, or something that's irrelevant. Something like sound poetry. People perhaps have seen this through something like Dada, where people make non-semantic noises to kind of generate a feeling in the audience, maybe sonic art you've heard of. Essentially, this could be connected to something that's purely an aesthetic experience, or perhaps, as I've discovered as I've gone into neuroscience and neuroaesthetics, it could be connected to something like the language every mother invents when they have a newborn child and they're trying to create not only linguistic structures in the child, but also emotional resonances. Doesn't that put a massively profound element onto the notion of something that's often seen as an irrelevancy, like sound poetry? So a huge element of my preoccupations are the question of why poetry does certain things and how that's worked throughout history. And I think there's an incredibly cogent connection between what we might say about consciousness and what we might say about poetry. So that's the case I'll make. For me, a huge element of this has to be said immediately that I'll obviously have to be speaking in massive generalizations. As I mentioned in my introduction to the entire event, the very notion of consciousness, well, the very history of consciousness is a history of people disagreeing about what consciousness is. There is no real definition of consciousness. What we can collectively say, though, and often this comes up in any discussion about consciousness, whether it's contemporary artificial intelligence discussions, neuroscience, or whether it's Locke in the 18th century, is that language has a huge part to play in the discussion. Even really contemporary theory, which has tried to chisel away at these varying definitions of what consciousness is, would suggest that the observable behaviour of other people, which they can verbally give to you, is the only evidence we might have for the problem of other minds. We all have consciousness in our own minds, self-consciousness, but can we ever know the consciousness of others? The only way to do that is through, often, verbal exchanges. So a huge element of what we need to really look at when we're talking about consciousness is the thing that poetry does, is the art form and the material that plays within that kind of literary medium. That's not to give poetry a grand purpose, it's just to specify a condition about poetry that most people don't. Poetry is very specifically the art form of language. And in that, saying that these definitions are not possible to really locate or resolve, therefore one has to say that the question one asks, especially as an aesthetic question, are not resolvable. There's no end point. It's not a scientific question where there might be a peer-reviewed, mediated central drive. But actually asking the question creates ramifications for one's thought as a poet or as an artist, which changes completely one's practice. And that's absolutely central, I think, to be mindful, to be aware of how your own art form might relate to these wider questions, and consciousness is one of those fundamental questions. That leaves us really with two fundamental questions. One, neither of them really answerable, but they should be asked. First, how does language relate to consciousness? How is language a constituent of consciousness? And two, how does poetry relate to language? These are enormous questions, not really relatable, but it's worth making a few statements about them in order to draw out a simple argument about what I think poetry can do or does do when it's good, I suppose. The first would be language. If you had to approximate it, I don't know, the grunts and the marks made by a group of apes that apes have codified to have a collective meaning in order to exchange information or have a discussion. Or perhaps to me, as it relates to consciousness, I think language is a way for us to control and mediate something which is fundamentally uncontrollable. If consciousness is anything, it is the perception of existence, and existence is something that is more than language. Language is always a lessening of actual experience. We all kind of know this. We know that we can't really find the right words for the things that we want to do. So language's relationship to consciousness, I think, perhaps ethically, or perhaps socially, historically, however you want to look at it, is a relationship of trying to draw out things that we can collectively agree upon within a space that fundamentally leaves us all confused. Consciousness, like experience in general, if it is experience, perception of the outer body and the inner world, is adversarial. It is difficult and confusing. And to me, language's place within that is a place of trying to get some sort of hold on what is otherwise something that's purely horrifying at times, I think. Not to be pessimistic or misanthropic, but that's what I think. The other question we'd have to ask is, what is poetry? Now, most people have a really clear idea of what poetry is, and without generalizing too much, historically there's been two models. One, which I think still has its kind of presence in our culture that most people think of as a poet, is what I would call the romantic notion, what Walter Benjamin called the metaphysical notion, or the theological notion. That is the poet, or the artist, or the novelist, or whatever, is the genius myth who sits alone, receiving his inspiration from a muse, a godlike figure, and takes that through some strange religious process and drops out a golden nugget which everyone surrounds him and claps and enjoys. It seems to me a bit like metaphysical fascistic. It doesn't seem to really relate to the way our thinking has evolved when it comes to science or other arts. The other model that's really been a huge part of kind of literary theory for 100 years or so is the model of the mulcher, the poet as someone who refracts the almost endless idiosyncratic language experiences of their world, whose job it is to choose, select, slice and place pieces of language from their experience onto the page, calling it a poem, and it gets treated as a poem because of that declaration. Now that to me is a fundamental engagement with consciousness. That's a phenomenological language act. That places the poet right at the heart of our experience of consciousness, because their attention, more than the novelist, is fundamentally on language at its purest form. And here's the central crux, the double act of poetry that people often don't focus on, which is key to what I'm trying to say about poetry and consciousness. A sculptor works in material and talks about it in language. A musician works in instruments and music and then talks about it in language. A poet works in language and talks about it in language. So what's the consequence of that double bind? Fundamentally, it's to give poetry the onus, or what I think is good poetry, interesting poetry, of doing something in language which is not the same as what language normally does. It doesn't carry semantic information, it doesn't create communication, it isn't didactic. Fundamentally, poetry uses the building blocks of communication, the things we use to try and control, mediate and express consciousness, to do something different than information or control. Now that's a really profound moment to me, because in this moment where we see language as a way of mediating something that's fundamentally difficult and uncontrollable, the endless experiences of our lives, poetry uses that material for something which not only doesn't also help to control, but maybe makes it worse. That to me is a very beautiful moment and a very ethical moment, because instead of turning oneself as an artist towards something which is about trying to get hold of maybe at heart the worst element of consciousness, the worst element of self-consciousness, which is the possibility of non-consciousness. In that confusion, in using that material for a purpose other than it would normally be used, you face that difficulty, that strangeness, and the possibility of death and expiry. And that to me is kind of the root of poetry. That's the ethical turn, and that's its engagement with consciousness. So I've done a series of projects recently that are about using some of the materials, the literal language materials of neuroscience and neuroaesthetics for a different purpose. So I've done a series of poems called the Neurocantos, where I've taken papers from neuroscientists and written poems only using language that was in the paper. So I'll read a tiny bit from one of those poems that was actually made up of a paper by Daniel Margulies, who will speak last today, and then I'll shut off. So this is called Tractography. A first scan, and then knelt down to the brain, a greenhold, the human brain, the circle reworked and began to prod within its waters, to find where else had been made. And found not much yet, but beginnings must be made. The hydrocortic cerebration is no friend to draw nor dream now. Can you separate the muscles for study? What charges brains more than some word that represents concept that is brain-bidden? Can you specialize music and then know it from childhood? And when you have your own children, the brain stuck, dies over west, the dark sea, avoid battle, mistrust scanning, and do not hop spiked park fencing. Thank you. So I'm not going to take any questions because that would be excruciating, and I will introduce our next speaker, which is Jen Kelleher. Jen is a poet, a writer, and a translator. She's the translator in residence at the Austrian Cultural Forum, and she writes articles on translation for the Quietus. She's just published a translation of a German novel with Fitzcarraldo Press, and has another coming out with Perrine Press soon. So please, a round of applause for Jen Kelleher.